Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Nice to be seeing you virtually. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is the important, and it's very, very important, to understand the difference between states and stages. And we need this discernment, first of all, because a lot of people conflate and confuse state experience with stage development. The early traditions really were all, when they talk about human development, they're talking about human development through states, increasingly subtle states. And when they talk about enlightenment, enlightenment means waking up to states experience beyond ego. So we can understand ego as it's related to the human mind and the superego. We can understand ego to be the habit of focusing all our attention on the physical and on the biographical self, the personal sphere of the self that was born in time, is finite, and will die in time. And as we wake up waking up has traditionally meant waking up to dimensions of the self, dimensions of our existence that transcend the limitations of the physical body. So one can wake up, when one only experiences oneself as a physical body, which would be a stage of development, ego development and ego body, when we're telling our parents, Mom, Dad, look how many times I can do the pogo stick. Watch me climb the tree. Count how long I can hold my head underwater. How many times can I hop on one leg? How many push-ups can I do? How far can I run? How fast can I run it? Those are accomplishments of the physical body, and one is identified with those when one is an ego and the ego knows itself only as a body. And as we wake up beyond materialism, beyond the physical body, we begin to wake up to the psyche, and we can know ourselves as a subtle psyche. And by subtle, I mean, where is the ego? Where is the superego? Where are our emotions? How much does love weigh? How much does aggravation weigh? Where is fear? Those are subtle subjective experiences. So we can wake up to the psyche and the emotional self, and the big chant of the 1960s and especially late 60s getting into the 70s of all the new emerging therapies were go into your feelings. How does that feel to you? So that's to get people out of ego identification as just being bodies and out of the gross realm of experience into the subtle realm, into the psyche. And we can wake up beyond the psyche to the soul. We can wake up to the soul through contemplation, meditation, cultivated or spontaneous spiritual experience, or through taking certain medicines, entheogens like psilocybin, ayahuasca, that wake us up to a dimension of the self that is more subtle than the psyche, because the psyche really very much represents a subtle projection of experience in a given incarnation. And we can start to wake up to a dimension of the soul, which is more subtle and potentially transcends incarnations. So we can wake up to ourself from being just a body to being a mind, to being a mind with psychodynamics, and beyond psychodynamics to being on a soul and a journey. And that soul is the intermediary between the physical and the non-physical clear white light of spirit. So again, the physical is gross, and the psyche and the soul are subtle, which are dreaming and visionary capacity. And beyond that, there's just clear white light. And there's no trace of the personal or the limited, the inherently limited in clear white light. And there's no trace of the personal, because that clear white light is the same clear white light for all of us. It illuminates all objects, but from the position of clear white light, those objects are transcended, just as dreams help us transcend the limitations of the physical body, and we're able to journey in dreams and do things and zoom in and zoom out of things in the psyche and in the soul, get big, get small, or be in an instant, be anywhere in the universe, really. In a dream, and just as dreaming deconstructs the illusion of the physical, so too does the vision of clear white light deconstruct the illusion of dreams, which are still objects in awareness, just like a rock or a planet. They're just more subtle. They're just more subtle. So development in the traditions has always meant state development, waking up and stabilizing waking up to increasingly more subtle states and stabilizing one's access to them, so that the imagery of the psyche and the imagery of the soul, and the soul in things, the subtle essence of things, becomes an increasing presence in our own self and more readily accessible to us in all things, so that we can perceive the souls, or if you will, spirit of all things. And this in Chinese medicine is just the transition from being a physical practitioner, maybe who just treats the physical body and sports injuries, to being a practitioner who can transcend but include that dimension of the physical self, so that one's medicine begins to include the patient's psyche and eventually their soul, and eventually the clear white light of spirit, as we grow to more subtle stages in our own development. But those stages that we're growing to are state stages. They're stages of increasing depth, of stabilization of ever more subtle states. And we want to be very clear that state development and stage development are two different things. So state development is waking up, but stage development is the other main integral imperative, which is growing up. And the difference between the two can be vast. And many of us have known people with incredible depth of state experience who can transmit very, very deep, high, wide, profound states very quickly when we're in their presence. But their stage of development might be relatively low. I was involved with spiritual teachers in my life who were less ethically developed than either of my two children were by the time they were 14 years old. And I'm not being cynical. I'm serious about that. So the traditions have been about state development, but stage development is the advent of understanding that humans, individuals, and cultures go through stages of development, is a relatively new insight. And that, whereas the East, Taoism and Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism and Tantra and the Vedas, they go through all kinds of vast descriptions of subtle state development. but they weren't aware of stage development. And they couldn't have been because there hadn't been that many stages by the time there were these traditions, the advent of these traditions during the Axial Age, 500 BC. They didn't have enough history to have a top-down view of history, and anything beyond their, literature really begins in the traditions about 700 BC to 300 BC during the Axial Age, and anything before that, all they had was myth passed down. And when they looked back in time, when Huangdi says to Chi Po, 500 BC, how come the sages of old used to live to vitality in their later years, and now in these days people are becoming decrepit in their 50s? Those sages of old were mythic sages. They were cavemen. Who were the sages of old, 500 BC? Who were the people who lived like Huangdi 10,000, 6,000, or 10,000 years ago? Well, these were hunters and gatherers with no or very minimal written language, who left no written records, and what they left were pottery shards. So they couldn't have really had a view of growing up, just waking up. And again, we have to understand there's a vast difference between waking up and growing up. One can have very high subtle state experience and be relatively immature ethically. And we could sit here all day naming names of teachers who, like Trungpa, Chungyum Trungpa, who brought Tibetan Buddhism to the West, who was a spiritual genius and no doubt radically enlightened, who drank himself to death, I believe in his 30s, and slept with hundreds upon hundreds of his male and female students. So there's a difference between waking up and growing up, and we want to be very clear of that. So we have a picture of the chakras here, 7 chakras, and we can just correlate states and stages of development to the chakras. Now, the chakras, even though they're mentioned, I believe, in the Vedas, I believe the Vedas only mention 2 of the chakras. And much of what we know about the chakra, or let's say much written about the chakras, is relatively new in the last few hundred years. And a lot of that comes from Western traditions like the Theosophists and not Eastern traditions. And while I have studied the Asian literature on them, what I'm doing is I'm just using the chakras and correlating them as body regions that have a relative evolution of capacity as we move higher and higher through them. So the capacity of each chakra is a center that has certain capacities, and the capacities of each chakra transcend but include the previous capacities of the previous chakras. Each of the chakras is a knot, a karmic knot that needs to be untied. So we could say in Chinese medicine, qi can flow and capacities can become integrated in a wholesome way to serve the whole of the person's being. And on the one hand, these are knots that need to be untied. And on the other hand, those knots are never in the way of a person having integrity to live up to what they know at any given moment. So we have to hold that dualism, that we have a life curriculum and we have knots to untie. And at the same time, they're ultimately not in the way. Now, the chakras are relatively gross morphologically. They represent large regions in the body. There are only 7. And just looking at this picture, we can understand that, for instance, Ren and Du And the Chiang Mai, the kidney and the stomach channels, run vertically along the course of these chakras, and that we can understand the points on Ren and Du and on Chang, and the vertical descent of qi down through stomach, and the vertical ascent of kidney jing up through the kidney channel, for instance, and the figure 8 that Ren and Du make around the body, the infinity sign, that's circulation. We can understand those points as a much finer gradation of evolution relative to body region and aspects of psyche. So if the chakras are 7 large centers of capacity, we could understand the gradation of Ren and Du and Chang with all of those points between each chakras as much more subtle and incremental changes of and evolution in terms of the evolution of waking up and growing up. And we'll get to that later in this class. So let's review the difference between states and stages. So first, let's deal with states. States come and go. In terms of the 5 elements, now it's winter, now it's spring, now it's summer, now it's late summer, now it's fall. Now I'm cold, now it's windy, now I'm hot, now it's damp, now it's dry. Now I have anxiety, now I feel fear, now I'm angry, now I'm in a rage. Now I feel joy, now I feel sorrow, now I feel abundant, now I feel not enough and worried, and now I feel grief, and now I feel longing. And we can understand that 5-element cycle, that Sheng cycle and Ko cycle, and Sheng Tzu, birth, death, is samsara. And we can understand the cycling of qi in it, that when the qi cycles and moves outside of us, we have seasonal change, and we have the daily light cycle, and we have weather. And inside of us, we have thought, feeling, we have emotion, and we have sensation. And all of that weather, thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation cycles through the Wu Xing, the 5 elements. And that character Xing in Buddhism means samskara. And consciousness becomes entrained to that wheel, to the state changes in that wheel, and identifies, gets lost in the content in that wheel, and tends to be conditioned. Consciousness becomes conditioned by thought, feeling, emotion, and sensation and experience. And samskara in Buddhism means the conditioning influence of one's experiences. And the point is to become free of those states, to develop a steady state in that form of consciousness, which is clear white light, which never moves. The soul moves. You know your soul moves because at night you're zooming around the periods, or seeing yourself laying in bed in a different, and you see yourself from across the room in bed, and you walk through a wall. The Hun travels. The Hun travels at night. The soul moves. So states come and go. And what I've noticed is that when people are conditioned by states, whatever they happen to be feeling in a given moment is what they think they've always felt. You work on a patient 51 weeks in a row, every week. 52nd week, they come in, their year anniversary, they say, you go, how you doing? They go, nothing's changed. You go, what? They say, I'm just the same. I'm stopping treatment. Nothing's happened. And you read them, well, the last 51 times you were, last week you said you're doing the best you've ever been doing. And the week before that, you said you were doing well. And I have like literally 51 notes here saying that you've been incrementally and regularly improving. And they say, nope, because all of a sudden they're kind of having a year anniversary and a law of cure. and all of a sudden nothing's changed. And so what I notice is that people, whatever they're feeling, as far as the ego is concerned, is what they've always felt and what they always will be feeling. A person gets sick and doesn't feel well, and they can't ever remember feeling well, and they think they'll never feel well again. And a person who's been in agony, and many of us have seen something analogous to this, but I'm speaking from my own direct clinical experience. A person who's been in agony for 7 months, you put 5 needles in, all of their arm pain disappears in 15 minutes, and they go out and play 18 holes of golf because they don't have arm pain anymore. Because when their arm is hurting, it's never going to be better. And the second it's gone, there's no problem. And they never had arm pain. And I think this is some kind of survival mechanism that we can't really remember pain when we're not having it. I think it's probably some kind of kindness that when we remember being in pain, we don't actually experience the pain that we were having. So whatever a patient's feeling and whatever state a person's having, they project backwards and forwards. The person who was in 3 abusive relationships serially and just spent 5 years getting out of the last abusive relationship, when they meet someone new 6 minutes later or 6 days or 6 weeks later, all of a sudden they're in ecstasy again, and it's never been like this. This is the one, it's never been like this. And they're happy and they're blown open, and that state that they're experiencing of expanded circulation and of projecting all the archetypes around their newfound relationship completely obliterates their last 47 years of experience. So states come and go, but whatever state we're experiencing, to the degree a person's unconscious, is just projected infinitely back and forward in time. And what people tend to do is they append whatever feeling they are happening, that is happening, to whatever is going on in their life. So whatever feeling is happening now, they will project the meaning of that feeling. So for instance, if a person has a chest cold and they have pressure on their chest, the pressure in their chest will trigger in them feelings of being depressed, because the phlegm in the chest are like clouds of grief that obscure the sun. And the physical sensation of really being in deep grief and having a chest cold can mirror each other, so they trigger the same emotions. And a person will take the emotion, the state experience they're having, and start projecting on whatever is going on in the moment. So there is no recent loss in their life, but they're feeling grief, and they start putting, something must be wrong in my relationship, or the work I'm doing is meaningless and I need a new career. And they just start projecting their state experience on whatever's currently going on. I've had a few very brave women and conscious women over the course of my clinical career completely come in, sit down, and completely volunteer. I screamed at my boyfriend or my husband all weekend. By Sunday night, I was absolutely convinced that we needed to divorce, that the relationship was over. And I woke up Monday morning and my hormones had shifted, and I could see that there was absolutely nothing to the entire experience, that everything I had been feeling just completely disappeared, as if a balloon had been stuck with a needle, pricked with a pin. It just popped and it just disappeared. So what people do is they project their state experience on the events of their life, assuming, one, that if they were aligned and they were leading a truly spiritual life, or if God was good, or if there was justice in the universe, they would be having a different experience than the experience they're actually having. And they can project the experience they're having inwardly on the nature of self, outwardly on the nature of existence, and certainly outwardly on people and relationships to people, relationships to career, relationships to institutions. And there can be all sorts of displacement. Displacing what's really going on and what they should really be looking at, to just manipulating their emotions and manipulating their states. And that's the thing about states, because they change, they are changeable. And when people are only aware of state development and not stage development, when stage development isn't in the picture, and their entire life can become a pursuit of increasingly more pleasant states. And, you know, I often had the experience in clinic that a significant population of my patients would like to be in a warm tub, surrounded by 3 to 6 people of their gender and sexual preference with palm fronds, you know, waving the palm fronds. And they would have a catheter in one arm with like Bujang Ichitang, and a catheter in the other arm with Shaoyang, and maybe a little Demerol and a little whiskey, a little pot. And they would be there and they, I'm a little agitated, I think. Turn the Bujang down, turn the Shaoyang up a little. Okay, that's perfect. Wait. Okay, maybe a little more Bujang. Yeah, that's perfect. And then 10 minutes later, you know, I'm a little too mellow. I think I need a little coffee. And then 15 minutes later, I'm a little too agitated. I need something, you know, maybe a little more Demerol. And just, you can see how much of culture is involved with manipulating state experience. And this is the antithesis of the actual path, because the actual path is to become so rooted and so grounded in that dimension of the self that doesn't change, the witness, consciousness itself, that all these going on and changings of states out in the wheel start to spin around us, and we become the witness of them and not intimidated by and shoved around by them anymore. And in terms of state experience, one of the big errors that both healers and patients make is the notion that I'll know when I'm well because I won't be fearful anymore. I'll know when I'm well because I won't be angry anymore. I'll know when I'm well because I won't be brokenhearted anymore. I'll know when I'm well because I won't be worried anymore. I'll know when I'm well because I won't experience grief anymore. And then the medicine is applied to continually manipulate one's state experience in the face of those experiences, to try to move to some other state experience which one finds more pleasant. And that is just being a slave. And so we want to understand state experience, and we certainly want to wake up. That's one of the great integral imperatives, to know ourselves not just as a body, but as a mind, not just as a mind, but as a psyche, not just as a psyche, but as a soul, not just as a soul, but clear white light. And we want all of that in the picture all the time. So whenever we're contemplating ourselves or we're looking at the world around us, we're embracing the gross physical, the subtle psychic, the subtle soul, the causal witness, and the non-dual, all simultaneously, just embracing all of it. Non-dual means we're embracing all of it. We're holding all of it. So that's state development. And you should contemplate as you go through the weeks before our next call. Notice the cycling of states. How often does your state experience change? It can change every 5 seconds. It can just change constantly. You're sitting there, you're listening, and all of a sudden you have to go to the bathroom. That's a state experience. All of a sudden you feel you need something to eat. Your blood sugar's dropping. You're a little bit thirsty. You're a little thirsty, so you take a sip. Those are state experiences. Now let's talk about stages. We can correlate the stages to the chakras, and then even more finely, we can correlate them to the evolution of the self through all the points on Rendu and Chang. And I talk in my red clinical practice text, I correlate all the inner and outer shu points with the points on the governor vessel. And then in the appendix of my green book, I lay out a whole book. In 4 pages, I lay out a whole book on Chinese physiology and the physiology of shadow. And I would love to write that book. It's definitely going to be my next book, and it's not going to be done in this lifetime because it would take me another 5 years to write that book, and I just don't think I'm going to do it. You never know, but it's very unlikely. But I laid out the basis for it, and either I'll come back and do it or someone else can do it. But the whole basis is there, and we'll see some of those charts here in this lecture. So every stage, as we go, as the self, the soul, the being evolves through stages, each new stage transcends but includes the previous stage. Every stage development itself creates an archaeology of the self. And the integral stage is the stage at which we gain a top-down view of the archaeological construction of the myth of our own ego. And we begin to wake up to ourselves, not just as an ego that was born in time, had 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years of life experience till this moment, but we begin to experience ourselves as a soul. That's a state awakening. We awaken to the soul as a subtle dimension of the self, and the soul has a deep time view of history and of the self. So each stage creates like a layer in the gorge of the self and is accessible. There's an archaeology of the self. And when we talk about shadow work in people, we need to understand where their traumas were. And these are usually in the first, for most people, in the first 3 stages of the self, the first, second, or third chakra. And we have to understand what their trailing edge is, their average level of development, and their leading edge of development. So a person could be, for instance, at a 5th chakra rational stage of development, and that stage is on average where they relate to life from, but under stress, they regress to a much, much younger self and become like Genghis Khan, 3rd chakra, and throw a temper tantrum and become power hungry. And whenever they don't get their way, they go into a narcissistic rage. And being average at a rational stage of development, but decompensating to be completely irrational, they can have a leading edge of development, which is that intellectually, so they're rational, but intellectually they understand holism and can explain it to you. They're not at a holistic stage of development It's a leading edge, and we tend to move into our leading edges intellectually before we fully integrate them and come to embody them viscerally and at a deep level. So each new stage transcends but includes the previous stage. Transcends means it has all the capacities of the previous stage, but it has deeper, wider, and higher capacities that the previous stage doesn't have. So a 5-year-old can fantasize and play with a imaginary playmate, but they can't do algebra. And a 12-year-old can learn algebra, but they don't lose the capacity to fantasize. They may not have an imaginary playmate like they did when they were 5, but they can still indulge in infantile fantasy. We all indulge in infantile fantasy when we buy a lottery ticket and put it in our wallets or pocketbooks or shirt pocket. And we start thinking, how am I going to spend my $790 million? That's infantile fantasy. That is not advanced visionary capacity to envision a better future. That's just, it's infantile fantasy. So the self of one stage becomes an object in the self of the following stage, which means that whatever stage we're at, what needs to be approached, whenever we get a patient, we have to know what stage of development they're at. Their average gravity, sort of center of gravity, developmentally, their trailing stages, and their trailing stages are going to be the place with major contradictions and unresolved shadow. And the unresolved shadow of the trailing edge is undermining the functional capacity of their average stage of development to healthfully consolidate so that it can be transcended by their leading edge of development. And the point of shadow work, at least in the developmental context I'm teaching it in, is to help resolve the early shadow by helping a person cease repression of the self, gain access to content that has been hidden from the self, reframe it now at a later date because now you're older, you're 20, you're 30, you're 40, you're 50, you're 60, you're 70, 80, 90 years old, you have that much more life experience so that you can reframe the conclusions you consciously and unconsciously drew when you were 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15, 16, 17, 18, basically maybe up to 21 years old, and you have more life experience, and now you can see them with a greater distance more objectively, learn the lesson, and let go of any of the meanings you created that, as true as they might have been, were very partial and actually dysfunctional and result in the repression of dimensions of the self congruent with a less than wholesome relationship to the self of others, and less than wholesome responses to life. Because what we want to do is we want no interaction to be insignificant, and we want to be able to respond to everything in life in a way that engenders the true, the good, and the beautiful. So because the self of any given stage becomes an object in the self of the next stage, that means who I am now, when I get off the pillow after meditating, the person who sat down should now be an object in the awareness of the person who gets off the pillow. The eyes that I'm looking through as I begin to contemplate should now become objects in the awareness of the person who has finished the contemplation. That's what development is. And as the process by which the self of a given stage becomes the object of the self of the following stage, means that that self that became an object had to die. Now, it just feels like death. It's not really a death because it is the ego really hasn't gone anywhere, but the self that had been the sole focus of one's attention and held here, now as we get some distance, it becomes an object in awareness that can no longer demand all of our attention because our capacity for attention has evolved and grown to a greater embrace. And that self that was the eyes we were looking through now just becomes a small, relatively small part of our experience, a smaller part of our experience. And because we have to die to the self for the next self to be born, there's a resistance. And the spiritual path is the path of understanding this process so well that one comes to have a deep understanding of it and a deep confidence in the goodness of it, knowing that when resistance arises, it means that I'm just shedding an old skin. And every time I've ever gone through a dark night, there's been light on the other side. And as dark as this current night seems, I have complete and utter immovable faith that the sun will rise in the morning and that my vision and my capacities will be deepened and expanded. Now, this is in bold because it's so important. Stages are the lens through which we translate states. This is completely lost on most people. But we're all should have enough experience here that you might be able to look back in your life and understand that in your more expanded moments, the expanded reality, the deeper and higher and wider state experience you woke up to, as mind-blowing as it was, when that state experience passed, you interpreted the meaning of that state experience through your actual stage of development. And this is crucial because the world is filled with spiritual teachers who've had vast, mind-blowing, heart-opening, mind-expanding, higher state experiences, who've done 100,000 hours of meditation and practices to stabilize their relationship to those experiences. But when they speak about what the experience means, they'll translate the experience through a top-down patriarchal dominator hierarchy that almost everybody on this call transcended by the 1960s. And if you were born later, you didn't do the work to transcend it. The transcendence of it was handed to you and educated and inculcated into you by postmodern people in the 70s and in the 80s, or even now the 90s, or if you're in your early 20s, the early 2000s. So we translate our state experience through stages. An Aztec priest would be totally capable of having a non-dual experience. And if you ask them what's the best way to respond to it, they'll say, next full moon, we're carving a virgin's heart out and we're going to eat it on top of the pyramid of the moon. That's how they translate their experience. So our state experience is translated through our stage of development. And it's just so important to not confuse the two. And when you meet a teacher, or somebody who can transmit very high states, that you not confuse their ability to transmit non-dual ecstasy to you and zap you into an expanded heart and an expanded mind, not confuse that with any notion that they might be ethically developed. And it doesn't mean they're not ethically developed. It just means you can't just look at what state you experience in their presence. You have to listen to them talk about what it means. And if all the men are sitting on one side of the meditation hall and all the women are sitting on the other side, or the men are in the back, or the women are in the front, or the women are in, or the men are in the front and the women are in the back, or the women all have to cover their faces, you have to look at what stage of development the person is translating their state experience through. And we tend to be blinded by state experience and get addicted to state experience and assume because a person or a medicine can transmit higher state and deeper state experiences that necessarily they are at a higher stage of development, and there's no correlation. There's very little correlation necessarily between state and stage development, between waking up and growing up. So the way stage development happens is that every stage brings in a new capacity. That new capacity solves all kinds of problems that were caused by the previous stage. And then people tend to absolutize the advantages of that stage of development because of all the problems the stage has solved. So mental rationality came in and it overthrew the traditions, which means it got rid of myth and superstition, and it got rid of witch trials. Rationale, there are no such things as witches, not in the sense they meant. And rationality brought in our capacity to generate data and study the material world around us and see through superstition and see through myth and construct automobiles and planes and central heating and down jackets and electric guitars and all kinds of great things. But it also gave rise to horrible things like the banjo. I'm just joking. And so people, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. He absolutized rationality as the ultimate principle. And that had strengths, and it also had weaknesses. And the weaknesses, it represses intuition. It represses the unconscious. It represses all of the gifts of the lower chakras, of the first three chakras. And it represses magic, all the beauty of magic. Magic has some ugly parts like human sacrifice, cannibalism, and witch trials. By cannibalism, I mean, the belief in Africa among certain tribes that if you get an AIDS and you eat an albino, that they can cure you, that it can cure you. So magic has some horrible aspects, but it has, very beautiful aspects, which we can see in a movie like Fantasia, for example, or The Lord of the Rings. You read The Lord of the Rings and you're taken into a whole other subtle world of beauty that can help us live better in this world, more harmony in nature and with each other in this world. So a stage solves problems caused by previous stages, then it becomes absolutized, and then the absolutization of that form of consciousness and of those capacities begin to create all their own problems, right? And when they create enough problems that at some point, the translations of that stage begin to fail. And one starts asking questions, and those questions relative to the limitations of the given stage can only ever be answered from the stage beyond it. Another big difference between states and stages is you can go from the lowest state of experience to the highest state in a trillionth of a second. Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheranism, who nailed the paper to the church door on the hypocrisy of the church, became enlightened on the toilet while taking a dump. I'm not making this up. I wrote a whole article on it called The Metal Element in the Anal Personality Type. And it's in the metal section, metal chapter of the Green Deepening Perspectives book, that content. So you can go from first chakra to non-dual seventh chakra in a trillionth of a second in terms of state experience. And that shouldn't be surprising to any of us. We probably all had experiences where we were feeling tremendous one second and god-awful the next, and vice versa. So you can go from any state to any state instantly and through multiple states quickly. I mean, think of this. You go into your doctor and the doctor says, Miss Jones, you know, you're feeling fantastic. Miss Jones, I know I told you that there was a 1 in 10,000 chance that you had cancer. But looking at your chart here, I'm sorry, but it's stage 4 and it's very serious. You're going to have a whole different experience. And he says, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I picked up Miss Abernathy's file. Oh, you're absolutely fine. So in about 10 seconds there, you're going to go from feeling fine to being completely shocked and seeing your whole life run before your eyes to being completely and utterly relieved and in a right? In 10 seconds. So states can go very quickly, and you can go from the lowest to the highest, or any place you are to the highest, to a non-dual experience in a trillionth of a second. But stage development, you really mostly just get downloads from the next stage. And sometimes maybe from 1.5 or maybe 2 stages higher than your current stage of development. But you're not going to be, nobody at a magic stage of development is going to download quantum mechanics. You've got a lot of stages to go through first. There's that last scene in Game of Thrones. It's literally the last scene. They're all sitting around thinking, who is now going to rule the people now that the Mad Queen is dead? Because she was going to be the ruler. And Cersei and her brother, lover, are gone. Who is going to rule the people? And one person stands up and says, well, why don't we let the people decide? After all, they're the ones going to be ruled. And there's a pause, and everyone else in the circle just breaks out laughing hysterically. You know, they're in Game of Thrones, they were at and they got this right, the authors. They were at a magical stage of development. You do not go from magic to constitutional democracy. It takes 2,000 years, at the 2,500 years, more or less, to go from magic to constitutional democracy, which is why you can't invade Iraq and Afghanistan and put in democracies. It's why it couldn't have ever worked and was insane to think it could work. So when we look at a patient, what is a patient's trailing edge, their average level of development, their leading stage, and where do they regress under stress, and And where are those in the body? And that's going to help us choose points, and it's going to help us choose herbs, and it's going to help us understand. So if a patient's average stage of development is fourth chakra, heart-centered, but they have congealed blood in the lower chow commensurate with sexual abuse, and they have some holistic leanings. We're going to need to resolve the congealed blood or the damp stasis in the lower chow, understand what psychic content and what life experience it's associated with, to help them look at it, cease the repression of it, integrate it into the self, so they can clear those shadows up, so they're no longer triggered, and then they're not repressed at the level of the heart, and then they won't get congealed blood at the level of the heart, and the heart blood can flow, and then they can open up more to the holistic possibilities, which are there leading, and start to transcend mythic membership. So when I was talking about translations beginning to fail, what I mean is that for 4 or 5 or 6-year-old, it's perfectly natural to believe in Santa Claus. And as we age and we go through school and we start to get more educated and do things like see advertisements for Christmas gifts on television, in ads, we put 2 and 2 together, and at some point, the translations fail of believing in Santa Claus, and you go, Mom, Dad, I looked up the chimney. No way a 200, 300-pound guy is getting down it with a bag of toys. I measured it. It's 8-inch diameter hole. No way. And you can't just, well, Santa doesn't really come down the chimney. That's just a story we made up. He comes in through the door, and the kid might say, When my daughter was about 10 or 11, she was 11 or 12, and maybe 11, and my son was 8. So let's think about it. He was 4 and she was 9. Okay, he was 4 and she was about 9, 4.5 and 9. I had a couple who looked just like Santa and Mrs. Claus. I mean, you would be shocked. I have a picture somewhere. They were both overweight. She had all white hair. He was big and round and jovial with a long white beard and white hair and bald head. And they dressed up as Santa and Mrs. Claus and came in for their treatment. And I had my kids there. And my son was totally down with it. He was like 4 or 5 years old. He was totally down with it. Hello, Santa. And he sat on his lap and told him what he wanted. And my daughter, who is now with A, but at the time she was my daughter, AJ, wasn't sure. But when she was a little skeptical, they were a little skeptical and looking at me like this. But when we left, AJ turned around and looked at them and said, "Goodbye, Mr. and Mrs. Claus. It was very nice to meet you." The translations were failing, but she had to hedge her bet, and there was no way she was going to risk being wrong, because it just might be Mr. and Mrs. Claus. But the translations are failing. We want to understand a person's average level of development and help them consolidate at the stage they're at as ground for a new stage of development. And to do that, we have to help them resolve whatever shadow they have that is impeding the healthy consolidation of their present stage. And we want to notice what translations of their present stage are failing, and what translations have failed from the last stage, and what translations are they still holding on to. So we want to transcend and include previous stages, and we'll have a whole class on this. But if I'm unhealthfully carrying along dysfunctional parts of a previous stage, it's the basis of addiction. If I'm dysfunctionally holding on to parts of a previous stage that should be transcended, it's the basis of addiction. And if I haven't included and am repressing healthy parts of past stages that need to be integrated into my current stage for healthy consolidation, then I have an allergy. If I'm repressing healthy parts of previous stages, then I'll develop an allergy. So these are the stages. So the first stage is, first chakra is archaic, it's survival. The only people at this stage of development as their center of gravity are going to be infants, the severely untreated mentally ill, and people with dementia. And the only other people who could possibly be at this level of development would be in tribes in remote regions that are untouched by modern civilizations. So you might hear about these an island in Fiji, or a group of 12 people living down in what's left of the Amazon in Brazil, or in deepest Africa, small group of people who are just untouched. I remember there's some island in the Pacific a few years ago, just 4 or 5 years ago, that a young missionary paddled his canoe out to read them the Bible, and they shot him with arrows and killed him. And the government, leaves those people alone and puts up warning and says, do not interact with these people. So they're the only people, other than the few remote clusters of individuals left on Earth untouched by the civilization for 4,000, who are still living like they would have 4,000 years ago, 6, 7, 8, 10,000 years ago. The only people at that level are infants, the untreated mentally ill, and people with Alzheimer's and dementia. And what they share in common is their existence depends on the kindness of others. If you leave an infant or a severely mentally ill person alone, or a person with extreme dementia, a person with extreme autism, they'll starve to death. They won't wash themselves. They'll get disease, they'll die, and probably die of thirst and hunger. They won't take care of themselves. The second chakra is magic. It's a borderline condition where there's really no difference in the reality between waking and dreaming. So this would be young children, half waking, half dreaming. This is called predicate identity in psychoanalysis. It's the stage of development where the only metaphor a person can make is based on shape or color. I remember when my daughter was about 3.5, her cracking up in the driveway at night when we were getting out of the car, and she pointed up to the crescent moon, and I said, "What, AJ?" And they looked up, and AJ said, "It's a banana moon." The only metaphor they can make is one based on shaping. The moon was yellow and it's shaped like a banana. And so they made a comparison, but they can't write like a Rolling Stone or all along the Watchtower or a Shakespeare. They can't, everything is just based on shape, color, size. So in this form of consciousness, schizophrenics have this form of consciousness. Mary's a virgin. Mary, the mother of God, was a virgin, and I'm a virgin, so I must be Mary. We share those two things in common, so we're the same. And that's magical consciousness. Walnuts have two parts and are wrinkled, and the kidney has two parts, and the brain has two parts. So walnuts are good for the brain because they tonify the kidney. This is magical thinking. And what happened with the rationalization of Chinese medicine under the auspices of the Confucians is they went through the 10,000 years of magical thinking and sorted out which relationships stood the objective test of time and which ones were just ridiculous. And they commented on this, which is it's ridiculous to say fire controls metal and a mouse is fire and a horse is metal, because if that was so, then a mouse would be able to control a horse. And a horse is much bigger than a mouse, and there's no such relationship. It's taking things too far. So this is half waking, half dreaming. There's no difference between carving a bison on a wall and painting an arrow in it and going out and killing a bison. When you painted it on the wall that morning, you already killed it. Now you just have to go out to the field and do the actual thing. But it's all, you killed its soul already in dream time. So that's magic. Third chakra is mythic. Magic mythic. It's magic mythic. And magic mythic is on the borderline between magic and mythic, and it's Genghis Khan, 2-year-old temper tantrums, and it's endoceptual consciousness. We talked about endoceps in, I believe, the second class, which are just, it's on the tip of my tongue. I have a feeling about it, but I can't verbalize it because it's not intellectual yet. It's not rational yet. It hasn't come into my mind yet. It's just a strong proto-emotion and proto-feeling. I can't even yet say I'm angry or I'm sad. I don't have the words to articulate the experience of how that piece of art makes me. It's on the tip of my tongue. And these are 2 to 4-year-old temper tantrums. When I don't get what I want, Genghis Khan, I'll take it by force. And my highest ethic in life is, can I get away with it? There's a sucker born every minute. Can I get away with it? And that's magic mythic. Just take by force. And so the second chakra is sexuality. The third chakra is power. So the first is survival. The second is sex. Sex just wants to fulfill the impulse right now. The first chakra is reflexive. An infant, you clap your hands and it just shudders. It can't initiate a movement through will. It can only react to input reflexively. The second chakra is instinctive, which is sexual, and instinct wants fulfillment now. And instinct is incapable of saying, okay, let's get together next Thursday night. We'll go to dinner, the movies, and when we get an instinct's like, clear everything off the table, you and me right here, right now. Third chakra is impulsive, it's power. Third chakra, no impulse control, right? Alcoholics, drug addicts are people who lack rapists, serial killers. These are people with no impulse, with various degrees of no impulse control. I'm not drawing an analogy between alcoholics, rapists, and murderers. What I'm saying is, and serial killers, what I'm saying they share in common is a glaring lack of ability to repress, to have top-down control of lower impulses. And that's Genghis Khan. I can take what I want by force, rape and pillage. Those 3 chakras are below the diaphragm, and the 4th chakra is above the diaphragm. And the 4th chakra is mythic, which is Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and all the myth of the great traditions. Christ rose on, he was the Son of God, and Mary was a virgin. And he was the Son of God, but he was also God, and he, and he was in love with the other Mary, interestingly, and he gave up love of that Mary in the human world for the sake of becoming one with his father. And that's myth. And from a rational point of view, it's totally ridiculous. But from a psychoanalytic point of view, we can appreciate myth as an adequate language of the subtle realm and the subtle dimension of the self. So fourth chakra, and what do we do at fourth chakra? We're now above the diaphragm, and what do all the traditions do? They repress the impulses and the instincts and the reflexes of the first three chakras. If we want a culture, no, you can't sleep with anyone you want. But, some traditions, but you can take concubines. Or you can have multiple wives, but you can't sleep with your neighbor's wife. And there have to be rules for culture to form, for the membership collective to come together. And every culture has its different rules for the functioning of that membership collective. And those rules are generally held together by myth. And fundamentalism is the literal interpretation of myth. And then we can get to the place of being mythic rational, fourth to fifth chakra, where the translations of myth fail, and we start to ask, is Santa real? Was there really such a person as Jesus Christ? It's interesting, but nobody in any culture mentioned him until several hundred years after he lived. But during the time he lived, no Roman ever mentioned him. There's no mention in any text, and we start to say, huh. So when we get to mythic rational, we start to question the myth, and then we get to rational, we get to the bottom of the fifth chakra. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And then we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to repress the first four chakras. The fourth chakra, the mythic chakra, they're laughable. Myth is ignorant. I mean, none of that stuff ever happened, and there's no proof. And certainly the sun doesn't move across the sky because a chariot is drawing it. The sun is the center of the solar system, and all the balls, the planets have mass, and they're all falling around it in a circle. Right? And someday that circle, all the matter in the solar system will collapse into that circle as a black hole, as the gravity of that sun that's collapsing forms a black hole and will suck all the matter in the solar system into it. And we can rationally know that. So bottom of the fifth chakra is rationality. And the top of the fifth chakra, we really start to become pluralistic. We can hold many points of view and have it start to wake up to the inner collective, all the voices in the self. We start to understand as dimensions of the self. We understand analysis is born, and we understand that it's not spirits out there, the dark hand that out there that are projected on witches and goblins and ghosts and spirits and ancestors is my own unconscious. And we begin to wake up to the fact that all of the traditions have their truths. So, and the Beatles, no isms. So John Lennon wrote this, one of the last Beatles songs. I forget, maybe it was the Ballad of John and Yoko, or maybe he did it on one of his first solo albums. No ragism, no bagism, no thisism, no thatism, right? Imagine there's no isms anymore, right? You have your truth, I have my truth. Nobody knows the truth. We deconstruct. We recognize through the works of Edward Sade and Michel Foucault, that reality is a cultural contract, and that what we call reality and what that those in power define what is true, that power is truth, right? And that it's the victors who tend to write history, and we can deconstruct all that meaning. So you have your truth, I have my truth, nobody knows the truth, and I have to be self-expressed at the throat chakra. I must speak my truth. So this is the beginning of the re-enchantment, which is we start to cease repression by waking up to the inner collective, all those parts of the selves, all those parts of the self, the internal family systems therapy is a real outgrowth of having woken up to the inner collective and understanding the function performed by each member of the inner collective, the firefighters, the protectors, and the different parts of the self. So this is, and in acupuncture school, I studied with people who were all postmodern, and their big joke was, now we're teaching the heart. The heart's the most important official. Now we're teaching the small intestine. The small intestine's the most important official. Now we're teaching the bladder. The bladder's the most important official. And the joke was they're all most important because when any one of them is dysfunctional, because at the postmodern stage of development, we start to become holistic and embrace holistic thought, that when any one of the 12 is dysfunctional, the 12 together as one are no more functional than the least functional among them. And that's the basis of holographic thought. So we sit in circles and we reach consensus, and we draw circles. And what's interesting is that 5-element chart, with the 5 elements and the 12 officials, and the 12 officials each showing the 5 elements within them, even though that was mapped out in the Nei Ching Suen, 500 to 300 BC, those relationships were mapped out. I've never found any historical document depicting them graphically till J.R. Worsley drew that picture in the early 70s or mid 70s. And that was after the first shots of Earth coming back from space. And those first shots of Earth coming back from space were necessary for the explosion of holistic consciousness into the membership collective. So at the 6th chakra, the bottom of it is holistic and integral. The people who are experts, who are rational scientists, can master a system. So they can become a nephrologist, a cardiologist, an endocrinologist, a sports physiologist, an otolaryngologist. They can master a system. But when we transcend the first 6 stages of development, when we transcend those first 6 memes, we can start to make systems of systems. And that's true holistic consciousness. In holism, I can read lab tests, and I can do 5 elements, and I can do 6 divisions, and I can do 8 principles and yin-yang thinking and 3 heater. So I can hold all the systems that are Chinese medicine, all the systems that are Western medicine, and I can make a single system of systems of systems. A single system of systems of systems. And as we consolidate the sixth chakra and become truly consolidate holistic and integral, a holistic and integral self. We start with agape, the love of the lower for the higher, to have a top-down view of our whole history. We start appreciating all the roles that all the dimensions of our own personal self have, and everything they've contributed to us, and how they've helped us survive. And we can start to hold them all in compassion, and we can let the self know it's all right. You can come out now, it's safe. And you can let all the parts of the self that were firefighters that radically protected those repressed parts of the self, you can let the parts that were repressing know it's okay. You did your job. You protected me. And here I am. And it's okay. I can reintegrate all those wounded, repressed parts of the self. It's all right, because I'm not going to take what happened personally anymore. And all those parts of the self that get triggered and hysterical whenever we're about to reintegrate that wounded, repressed, lost part and protected part of the self, we can let the firefighters know it's okay. No, you did your job. You don't have to get upset anymore. I'm an adult now. I can handle it. I can take care of it now. And when they go, but what do we do? You say, what do we do? All we've ever done. It's like the end of The Princess Bride, where Inigo Montoya, he's asked by Wesley, Prince Wesley, he says, what are you going to do now? And he goes, I don't know. I've been in the revenge business so long. I hardly know what to do with myself. And Wesley says, well, now that I'm going off to marry Princess Buttercup and live happily ever after, I'm not going to be the Dread Pirate Roberts anymore, and we need a Dread Pirate Roberts. Maybe you could do that. And Inigo goes, oh, yeah, I could see that. That'd be interesting. So beyond holistic and integral, which are the first stages, so in postmodernism, we begin to wake up to the inner collective and see all the traditions and appreciate all of the traditions. Wow, 2 crows and an owl just flew right by my house, by my window. A beautiful barred owl just flew right by my window with 2 crows right on top of it. So that's why I all of a sudden looked right out the window. So that is just very, very cool. That was very, very beautiful. Okay, well, I actually paused and I went out to try to find the owl, and I did find it, but it flew too deep in the woods to get a photograph. So that's why my eyeglasses are dark, because they change color. So they will fade back soon. So anyway, once we establish ourselves at holistic and then integral stages of development, we then get to the top of the 6th chakra, which is a step over into the transpersonal stages of development. And this is the visionary capacity. The 6th chakra, of course, is the 3rd eye. And this gives us construct awareness. So the lower dimension of construct awareness is that at postmodern, when the re-enchantment of the self begins, we become aware that all social constructs, all socially agreed, all social agreements are social agreements, that reality is essentially a social agreement and is constructed. And I think we all understand that. So we understand cultures have differences and their agreements that any membership collective makes in order to ensure it, to define who's in and who's out, is a social construct. So we understand, for instance, simply that the fact that we go on green and we stop at red and slow down on yellow is a construct. It's an agreement. We could stop at green, go on red, and slow down on yellow, or an inch could be this big or an inch could be that big. It's just important that we agree to what it is. When we talk about construct awareness here, what we're talking about is the visionary capacity at the top of the sixth chakra to understand everything. The chair you're sitting on is constructed. Your ego is constructed, your superego. It's not just that meaning is constructed, the superego's meaning, but that all of creation is construct. The whole physical universe is a construction of mind. And of course, this is endemic in Buddhism, for instance, that the entire universe is a projection of mind. So when we get to the seventh chakra, the bottom of it is causal witness. And the capacity for all thought, feeling, emotion, sensation, and all of experience to occur as objects in experience, objects in awareness. And we understand that all those objects, from the most gross to the trees I'm looking at out in the woods and the chair I'm sitting on the desk, those are gross objects in awareness. But thought, feeling, emotion, sensation, and all the meaning that my mind creates is an object in awareness. And I can start to see the mind creating meaning in real time. And that occurs as an object in my awareness in real time. And the top of the seventh chakra is non-dual. And from that perspective, compassion and love are infinite. All is self. The evolution through all these stages is that each successive stage has a wider and wider embrace of what early stages occur to us as other. And as we get to higher stages, each successive stage embraces what was other to the previous stage as self. So when we get to postmodernism, fifth chakra, top of fifth chakra, we start to really embrace others as self. Walk a mile in my shoes. We understand that there are differences between the traditions, but they're all speaking to one universal truth. So everything as it is in non-duality. Everything is as it is, and it is the spiritual path is working with everything as it is. And we are the agents to improve it, to catalyze the emergence of the true, the good, the beautiful. So every stage has its addictions, every stage has its allergies, every stage has its shadow, right up through non-dual. So a person can have a non-dual state attainment and be stabilized in the non-dual and still has early shadow, which is corrupting it, so that even though they're stabilized in non-duality, they're still stealing money or sleeping with their students' partners. So again, we want to determine the difference between state and stage. When we talk about shadow resolution in this class, for us, ourselves, and our patients, most of what we're talking about, 80–90% of what we're talking about, are resolving shadow at the first three stages, first three chakras, maybe at the fourth chakra. Well, actually, there's a lot of fourth chakra shadow. So how can I explain that to you? There are a lot of people who listen to the Grateful Dead, take LSD, take ayahuasca, go do harmonic healing with gongs, do yoga and are into the whole self-help thing, who look on the outside to be postmodern. But the second you disagree with them politically, they'll riot in the streets and burn your house down and get you fired from your job at the university because you disagreed with them you supported the Palestinians or you supported Israel, and you're going to lose you or Israel, and either way they're not instantly recognized to not be part of your membership collective, and you'll cancel them. So that is, so people can have the outer trappings of a stage, the outer surface structures in terms of music and authors and movies they like and types of food, and they can seem worldly. But when push comes to shove, you can see that they don't have room for other views. They can't embrace other perspectives. They are not pluralistic. They are actually in a very tight membership collective. And if you're not voting for RFK, baby, you don't get it. You see? So that's how that works. So this is the stage development of operations. So we go from reflexes to instincts, a body self. A body self, look, mom, how many times I can do the pogo stick. A name self, when you're a name self, the body becomes an object, but you become an I, and you want your name to live forever. You want the, and people at a name self are, the level of development are people who go out and commit, they take a gun to a school and they kill 17 kids because they want their name. They want everyone to be speaking their name. And when you're at a name self level of development, the greatest thing that could ever be done is people would build statues of you that would be venerated through generations so that your name lives on. And then we become, a reflex self, an instinctual self, a body self with all its compulsions and impulses, then a name self. The I begins to emerge. I am John. I am Mary. Me, I. That's the ego begins to emerge, not just the body ego, but an ego identified with a name. And then a membership self, right? So the infantile self, the infantile ego now becomes an awareness in the membership self-consciousness. It becomes an object in the consciousness of the membership self, and the infantile ego, with all of its instincts and its reflexes and impulses, is now repressed. And oral sex is no good, and anal sex is no good, and men only sleep with women, and it's bad to be gay, and it's bad to be trans. And this is how things are if you want to be in our collective. But we can master and repress. We master the infantile ego through repressing it. And the problem with that is the people who are triggered the most by all of those former things I mentioned and screaming the loudest about them are just repressing them, and they're acting them out when nobody can see. And that can either be literally acting them out with choir boys and young children, as is done and has been done so grossly in the Catholic Church, which just about invented repression historically. It came at the same time as all the other traditions that also repressed. That's what the fourth chakra does, is when you're at that stage of development, to join a collective, and then you have to repress the lower impulses, and then to evolve beyond that, you now have to emerge out and differentiate out from the collective. So the membership self masters impulses, but it does it through repression, and then tends to either really act those things out in quotes in private, or if it's not actually doing it, it fantasizes about it. And it watches it watches unwholesome things on the internet that it would never admit to doing, that it's telling everyone not to do in real life. So then we become the rational self. Each stage, when it emerges, to consolidate has to repress the previous stage until we get to a fairly high stage of development where we cease repressing. So at the rational self, and the rational self, rules and roles now become objects in awareness. So the rules and roles of the membership community now become to the rational self shibboleths and ridiculous rituals that people are performing that they don't even know the meaning of. And here we gain formal operations. And formal operations mean that for the membership self can act on the body to repress the body, but the rational self can now start to operate on ideas, on thoughts. And then we have logic beginning to emerge. As rationality emerges, we see the emergence of logic. And of course, Socrates was put to death because he represented an individual whom rationality was emerging in people who were at a mythic membership stage of development. And when he started saying there are no gods, he had to drink poison. And then we become a pluralistic self. And the pluralistic self can now deconstruct hierarchy, and it can start to deconstruct all the rational constructs of culture and say all of those things that you say are real, all of those formal operations, that's just your truth, man. I'm not bound by the law of physics. I'm not bound because I'm more than that. I'm more than just the physical self. I can dream. I can envision a better future and bring that future here right now. And then we become a holistic and an integral self. And that holistic and integral self can see all these earlier stages. The hallmark of all these earlier stages are they're all at war with each other. That's the culture wars. And the holistic integral self now has a top-down view, can embrace the relative weaknesses and strengths of all these former capacities and hold them in love, without shame, and appreciate what each one brings to the party, and also appreciate what needs to be left behind and what needs to be brought ahead. And of course, in my clinical practice book, The Homework, I go through all this in great detail. So you'll get to read it. And you can also listen to this as many times as you like. So this is the master chart from my Deepening Perspective book. These are the pre-personal stages, the personal stages, and the transpersonal stages. These are color codes according to the light spectrum, the spectrum of light. So infrared would be the archaic stage of development, survival. And magenta and red would be magic and magic mythic. Amber would be mythic to mythic rational. Orange is rational, green is postmodern, going all the way to clear white light, which would be non-duality. And these are the names of the stages of culture. And these are the stages of culture and of the self as they develop. And at every stage, you have gross, subtle, and very subtle manifestations. The gross, the subtle, and the causal, the gross dimension of the self, the subtle dimension, and the very subtle dimensions of the self are like a tube, and every stage. So even we know that 3-month-old children, infants, 3-month-old infants have the same brain waves that adults have when they're dreaming. So by 3 months, an infant can dream. So it has a subtle self. It's not dreaming in words that, and a language, because language hasn't emerged yet. It can't dream in English. It can't dream of a form and say duck or fire truck or mom, but it can see the image of mom and respond in its dream to that image. The eyes start focusing at 3 months. And as the eyes focus, images start to be seen as other. So we become a body ego, a mind, an ego, a soul, and ultimately a spirit through all these stages. This is just another chart of the stages. Pre-personal, transpersonal, pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal. But now I've correlated them with points on conception vessel and governor vessel. And then you can do the work and correlate them with points on Changmo to understand the gradation. So at CV1, GV1, that's the root chakra, and that's survival. CV4, GV4, CV4 to 6, GV4, kidney 13. We have second chakra, sexuality. And here are the functional capacities. Here at the lower chakras, we're completely embedded. And then we have instincts. By the time we get to third, the higher chakras, assimilation, communion, communication, synthesis, witness. So here we have the areas of the body, right? So root chakras, mouth, nipples, belly button, anus. And Freud talked all about the evolution through these. The child, the infant is suckling. And so when we want to work with first chakra, clear up first chakra shadow, we can often work around the mouth, points around the nipple, points around the belly button to clear up shadow there. So these are various stages of development, and these are various capacities. So the substitute gratifications and capacities. So the first chakra is sucking and suckling in the mouth and the po and the oral fixations. And then we get to second chakra, sex, which fantasy. Third chakra, power, and the becoming a body self, and Genghis Khan, and willpower, the imperial self. And this is around CV12, assimilation. Fourth chakra is the heart, membership self. Fifth chakra is really the beginning of breaking out of the membership to become a self-actualized individual. The sixth chakra is self-actualization and the transcendence of being an individual self to a truly transpersonal self. So when we culminate self-actualization, we step into the transpersonal, and the crown chakra is the purely transpersonal. We begin to step into the transpersonal as a soul and fully develop into it at the stage of clear light. So we have survival, sex, willpower, belonging at the fourth chakra. At the fifth chakra, gotta live my truth. At the sixth chakra, visionary capacity. I have a dream. And when I'm talking, Martin Luther King talks about that dream. He brings the future in which all human beings live a life of dignity and respect, free from fear or persecution, into the moment of his speech. And that's that third chakra, that third eye capacity at the sixth chakra. Seven chakras bliss, and then top of seven witness, and then top of seven chakras, just everything is as it is. Here is just another map of the stages according to the chakras and the stages of development according to the meridians. And here we have Chang mapped on stomach and kidney, and Ren and Du. So here's ren, here's kidney, here's stomach, here's spleen, and we have all the much more discrete than the chakras, all the individual pairs of points to resolve issues at various stages of development and to help cease repression, ceasing repression, clearing up shadow. So later stages of development above the diaphragm can now develop because the diaphragm is open and the unconscious below the diaphragm is in free and easy communication with consciousness, and it's a collaborative effort. So here is the bottom up, the first three chakras, and top down, the second three chakras. And in the middle, so that's 6. And in the middle, we have the fourth chakra, 3 below, 3 above, heart chakra. And the heart's the first above. And you see Jesus or Buddha with the heart on fire, and Jesus with the sacred heart with the fire in his chest. And the heart being the halfway point is the point at which we've differentiated out of the unconscious into a membership collective. And in that membership collective, there can be transmission, the heart can open. But what's important is at the fourth chakra, we can begin to get downloads from the seventh chakra. And Jesus and Buddha become individuals, and they get the download from the fourth chakra. And the Buddha says, I am that. And Jesus says, I am one with the Father. That's state development. That's waking up at the level of fourth chakra to the transpersonal non-dual view of the eighth chakra, seventh chakra rather. But it's still going to take a lot of work to create culture. Most of the culture in the world today is at a pre-personal stage of development. When you see a woman at a Trump rally wearing a t-shirt that says, go ahead, you can grab me by the you know what, that is not a person who has become an individual. That is a person who is in a membership cult and identified with a cult based on similarities of membership myth and skin color, which is not a personal. People who become personal stage of development, you become rational and you begin to actualize and self-actualize an individual self by recognizing and beginning to live up to the dictates of one's own life curriculum stored in the soul. You become an individual. You've differentiated out of the unconsciousness to become a member of a membership cult. And then you have to once again differentiate out of that ocean to become an individual. And once you've done that, then you begin differentiating out of being an individual into the transpersonal ocean, because you've seen through the self that you constructed. But this is entering an ocean, a transpersonal ocean on the later side of complexity, and most people are at a pre-personal stage of non-differentiation, not a post-personal stage of having merged with all things, a pre-personal stage of being merged with all things and not yet becoming an individual. Most of humanity is at this stage of development. You just have to look around. It can sound elitist to say it, and people could accuse it. People could and have accused this of being just something white men thought of to make themselves superior, which of course would undermine all the people of color who actually are in this stage of development and become self-authored and change the world through changing themselves. This is a master plan. This is, if you read the appendix of Deepening Perspectives, one of the charts that lays out the deep developmental physiology of Chinese medicine. And I go through the relationship of CV4, kidney 13, primordial path, door of infants, and water path. And I go through, I think, CV8, spirit tower, with stomach 25, heavenly pivot, and kidney 16, heart pit shoe point. And then I go through CV 17, kidney 23, and stomach 17, and what they have to do with each other. And I go through those 3 points in each of the 3 chakras to explain, to show developmentally how the points are related. And then I basically tell the reader, I've done this, you do the rest for yourself. And I know people would wish that I would write that book, but it would take me 5 years to 10 years. And I'm 60, turning 66 in a couple of weeks, and it's just too much to take on. I do think I've made my contribution in that way, and now I'll just teach. But you can understand the chakras as physical reading, having gross physical, subtle psychic, subtle soul, and non-dual clear white light dimensions to each of them, and an evolution of the self through the chakras, an evolution of capacities, both in terms of state awakening and stage development. We have people at non-dual stages of state development, but postmodern culture itself, the capacity of people at the culture where people are at a true pluralistic stage of development is only like 30% of the West. And it almost doesn't exist in the East. People in the East can be postmodern very quickly when they get exposed to Western culture. So I mean, there are definitely postmodern people in Japan, for instance, and probably there were even some in Hong Kong. Hong Kong really was allowed to get to a modern stage of rationalistic development, but now the communists have taken it over, and they're doing away with that and making that illegal, legislating states and stages of consciousness. So, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find an authentic postmodern person in mainland China. That doesn't mean a person couldn't move out of mainland China and in 5 years become postmodern, because you can go through stages that other people have cut the grooves for very quickly. But the difference between states and stages, a main difference is you can go from one state to another, hop, skip, and jump. But in terms of stage development, you have to go through all the stages in order. You just can't skip a stage. Okay, hi. I'm back. I went to dinner. I know it's weird because for you it's only been 3 seconds, but for me it was an hour. Sort of like space travel. Anyway, here we have stages and their dysfunctions. Now I do sum this all up and I talk at great length about it in Deepening Perspectives, but I'd like to go through them here. I've paired the dysfunctions with the stages, and I've correlated them roughly with acupuncture points. So the archaic stage, CV1 to CV2, if you're so wounded at the first chakra that no subsequent development happens, you're autistic, and deeply autistic. You're not, you're at the far end of the spectrum. So if you take an infant and you don't touch it and you don't give it love, it develops into extreme autism or psychosis. Because you need touch, you need relationship to bring you out of that, to bring consciousness out of that being completely and utterly embedded in the unconscious and in the void. So if you're so wounded at the first chakra that subsequent development ceases, you're autistic. If you're so wounded at the second chakra, roughly CV2 to CV6, and the corresponding governor vessel points and Chiang Mai points. If you're so wounded at second chakra, at the magic borderline stage of development, you become psychotic and you can't tell that there's no difference between waking life and dreams. Every thought, every fantasy you have is as real to you. Every thought you have, every emotion, every fantasy is as real as anything actually going on in the material world. If you're wounded at third chakra so that there's no significant subsequent development, this is about the imperial stage, the Genghis Khan stage. It's right when you start getting language and you're at a transactional stage of development. You become wounded at that Genghis Khan stage, you're aggressive, and there's narcissism and rage. Magic method combined with magical thinking, total self-centeredness. We have an incredible model in our ex-President Trump of a man who was so wounded at the third stage of development that no significant development took place after that. Obviously, he developed somewhat intellectually after that. I mean, he can speak with relatively more coherence than a 4-year-old. But if you actually listen to what he says, it's gobbledygook. And he has a completely transactional level of development. He was walking with a general, I think in Normandy, through the fields of buried soldiers to commemorate Second World War. And he looked at him and he said, you know, these guys were suckers. What was in it for them? What was in it for them? Transactional means what's in it for me? What do I get out of it? And this is early shadow. And the diaphragm is the embodiment of wall. These 3 stages are prior to it. And most of what we're going to talk about when we talk about shadow resolution with most of our patients and with ourselves, we're talking about resolving shadow from these first 3 chakras. Now, all the stages have their shadow. All of their stages have their potential allergies and addictions, their potential dysfunctions, their potential substitute gratifications. But the average level of development in humanity on average is so low that most of what we're talking about here is early shadow. You have to be quite an evolved human being to have resolved significantly your shadow from the first 3 stages. And nobody is going to consolidate the holistic and the integral stage of development with any significant degree of shadow in these 3 stages. And in fact, it's not possible to consolidate even rationalism if you have significant shadow at lower stages, because you will appear rational, but you will decompensate under stress. And the 2 patients I ever had who called me on the phone insisting they had become enlightened to me, both wound up in psychiatric lockdowns. And one was a psychiatrist and the other was a psychotherapist. And they could both compensate to function reasonably well in the world. And the one I knew who was a therapist she used to send me tons of patients, and her patients loved her and felt she was helping them. But under stress, she had a complete psychotic breakdown. So the diaphragm is this this wall between consciousness and the unconscious. And when we get just above it to membership, the most important thing to us is belonging. This is the stage of development where when you want something and you're not getting it, your first impulse is to say, please, I'll be your best friend. Because belonging is the highest value that you have. And if one is so injured at the fourth chakra that they don't develop substantively beyond it, the fourth chakra being membership is about ritual. Whenever we enter the room, we enter from this direction, and this person wears blue and that person wears red, and we face the southwest corner and we say this and we do that. And to be injured there is that you've lost, you're a fundamentalist and you've completely lost the essence of the ritual and any metaphoric nature that it had, pointing to subtle realities. And you're just neurotically doing the thing over and over and over again as a ritual, but you don't know what the meaning is. So at the fifth stage of development, if you stop developing there, this is rationality, and you become a materialist. Everything is physical, everything's science, and everything can be known. And everything can be tested, and anything that isn't known will eventually be known. And when it comes to things like chi and love and all these things that can't be measured, it's just a matter of time before we can measure them. And that's delusional, because love may have a physiological correlate, but there is no molecule in the world which itself is love. It's just a physical correlate. Those hormones can just be physical correlates of inner subjective realities, but they're never congruent with them. So having a development arrested at a rational stage just leads to materialism and repression of all the subtle dimensions of the self. Postmodernism, one becomes able to deconstruct all of the dominator hierarchies, patriarchy, matriarchy, deconstruct the authority of the state, deconstruct the authority of experts, deconstruct the church. You have your truth, I have my truth, nobody knows the truth. Every point of view is equal because it's a point of view. And it conflates pluralism with relativism. Pluralism is the capacity to see through many perspectives. Relativism is making all those perspectives equal because they're all perspectives. And since they're all perspectives, they're all equal. And this is what I labeled hierarchy deficit syndrome, HDS. I've just got to speak my truth, baby. You have your truth. I know you studied Chinese medicine for 45 years and wrote 3 textbooks. And I'm a chapter into the web that has no weaver, and you have your truth and I have my truth. You see? So the strength of a stage of development is also its weakness. It's a great strength to be able to deconstruct dominator hierarchies and power differentials in social relationships. And it's also a great weakness to only be able to understand all relationships as being only power differentials. So in postmodernism, we have pluralism, the capacity of many points of view. We awaken to the inner collective, and we have to speak our truth, our individual truth, and we break out of the membership collective. I have to do my own thing. Do your own thing, speak your truth, live your truth, follow my bliss. And this is the beginning of self-authoring. And then we get to the second tier stages. In holistic stages, people can get addicted to wholes or allergic to wholes. Addicted to wholes mean it's all one, and the ego doesn't exist, and everything is one, and there's no differences. In postmodernism, everyone has a point of view, their own truth, and the individual is seen as the highest manifestation of the universe. In holism, it's all one, and we're going to repress now all the individual manifestations because there's always just one thing happening. So a person gets addicted to wholes, or it can get allergic to wholes, or rather addicted to wholes, or allergic, develop an allergy. I shouldn't have wrote allergic to wholes. An allergy to the idea that people are unique, and that people do have their own truths and their own perspectives, because you see it as one. And so when people start coming out of the notion of everybody being a unique individual, you get an allergy to that and just see it as narcissism and try to repress it. So in integral, we transcend even holism, and in integral, we now have full access to the gross, the subtle, and the very subtle dimensions of the self. We may not be living in clear white light or the witness, but in 1 second, we can always find it. We can always find, because it's a known and an awakened dimension of the self that we've cultivated a relationship to. Integral is the culmination of self-authorship. And as we culminate self-authorship, we begin to transcend the personal and step into the transpersonal. And this can create an existential crisis. Are you kidding me? I just spent 40, 50 years building a self, becoming an individual, breaking out of the membership collective, introspecting, doing cultivational practices, and I know who I am. And just at the moment I do, I see through it and I realize, oh my God, the self I became is a myth of my own personal design and creation. It's totally constructed, and I'm the one who's constructed it, and I have to deconstruct it. And of course, awakening to emptiness and the authentic self, and awakening to oneness and clear white light begins to deconstruct the illusion of separation between ourselves. I mean, non-duality is the elimination of separation within the self, but also with all people and all things. Integral is the leading edge of development of humanity. Maybe like, I think Ken Wilber says something like 3 to 4% of people in the West are at or around integral stages of development. But the thing is, we lead with the cognitive line, and there are a lot of people who can understand integral intellectually because they're smart and they can read the books and talk about it, but they don't behave integrally. Some of them can't, for instance, actually even hold multiple perspectives at the same time and understand another person's perspective. So we have very little culture that exists at the integral stage of development. There are meetings a couple times a year where people will travel from all over the world just to meet other people at integral stages of development, because it's not like you can walk out your door and necessarily find them. Very few people. And so there are people who talk about stages of development beyond integral. And I'm highly suspicious of that. There may be individuals with leading lines into the earliest transpersonal stages in terms of actually growing up to that stage. There are plenty of people at the higher stages waking up at state development, but they haven't generated. But if you ask them to speak about their experience, they'll talk about it through a membership stage or through rationality or postmodern stage of development, or a holistic or an integral stage. And there are just so few people relatively in the world, even at a postmodern level of development. Look what's happening in Florida, and look what the Republicans are doing. They ran on this Ron DeSantis and his whole political thing, anti-woke thing, is really running against postmodernism. Ronald Reagan ran against and won. He ran against postmodernism. Trump is running on behalf of the 2 to the 4-year-old stage of development, Genghis Khan, uncontrolled capitalism that's purely transactional and has no responsibility to any of the people in culture. And so we get to the third tier of development. People at these stages can get just lost in fantasy. You see people at transpersonal state stages of development, and they're lost in pursuing state experiences, meditation, another satsang, more bliss, ayahuasca every month. Who needs to take ayahuasca every month? I took it 4 times in my life, and that was 4 times plenty. That was plenty to look into for the rest of this incarnation. And so people can get lost in it. And this is just lost in fantasy, the intermediate realm. People do Jungian analysis for years. And when you're paying $200 for a 50-minute hour, believe me, you're going to dream. And the dreams, enlightenment is limitless and samsara is limitless. And people can just get addicted to the Bardo realms, to the intermediate realms. And Patanjali and Liu Yiming and Sri Aurobindo wrote all about the intermediate zones and all the people who stop halfway. And as at the causal witness level, people can get stuck on bliss. I knew spiritual teachers, worked closely with them, who were addicted to the bliss of the witness and the distance it gave them from everything. And just, they slept with 5 of their students and their worldwide community fell apart. And when they were asked 10 years later, what do you most miss about the community we had? They said, my daily massage. It's total narcissism. It's narcissism. It's all about me, baby. I miss being driven everywhere and having all my meals cooked for me and getting a massage every day. So here's a list of substitute gratifications. So the first chakra, when the mother's nipple isn't present, the infant sucks its thumb and then regresses back into wholeness. Second chakra, the person regresses into wholeness in orgasm and it becomes sex. Third chakra, person is addicted to power. Fourth chakra, to belonging. I'll be your best friend. Fifth chakra, self-esteem and self-expression. I have to speak my truth as a sign of self-esteem. You have your truth, I have my truth. Nobody knows the truth. And I'm going to stand up for myself and speak my truth. And that's self-esteem. And that's why in the 1970s, when pluralism explodes post-World War II, in the 1960s, and in the 1970s, you have all these, Tony Robbins, you can do it, you can do it. And all these pyramid schemes where you take courses that teach you to be spiritually aligned so you can sell lots of soap. And if you're not selling enough soap, you have to examine your belief system about yourself. It's all self-esteem. So 6th chakra is visionary, and people get addicted to imagination and lost in the intermediate zone. I need more psilocybin, baby. More tantric sex, more visits to Machu Picchu, another darshan. Could you do that point between my eyes again? It was really, really good. I just love that formula you gave me. I want to take it forever. How much, like, if I got 40 bottles, you think it would be okay to bathe in it? People just get addicted to bliss states and to imagination. And the 7th chakra is just bliss, witness. thought, feeling, emotion, sensation, everything that happens just is. I have the all-seeing eye of the universal witness. I'm Arjuna in the chariot, and Krishna has just given me the cosmic vision that everything is born and everything dies in the same moment, and that it's all just a great play and none of it's real. It's all just a projection of mind, and I'm free. I'm free. And because I'm free, I'm in bliss, I'm in ecstasy. And I have known teachers, that teacher I talked about, who the thing he missed about his teaching was the daily massage, just addicted to bliss. After he slept with 5 students and the teacher and got thrown out of his community, he was interviewed by a friend of mine. And his friend said, isn't there some minimum standard a spiritual teacher should hold themselves to or be held to? And he said, no, my students all learned the exact lesson they needed to learn. And the good is good because it's good, and the bad is good because we can learn from it. In other words, it's all good, man. It's all good. So allergies and addictions are failures to transcend and include. The degree that an individual is triggered is commensurate with the amount they're repressing, which is commensurate with the degree of shadow they have, which is commensurate with how victimized they are by being triggered. And the degree to which they're victimized by being triggered is the exact degree to which they're willing to victimize others, and will victimize others as just a reaction and a projection. Allergies are a failure to include the good parts from previous stages of development. So when we say transcend and include, we mean transcend the limitations of a previous stage, but include the best parts of it. And to healthfully consolidate any stage, we have to have brought along the best from all previous stages, while excluding all of the dysfunctions that our new stage has proven to be false, wrong, and untrue, and no longer wholesome. So it would be good to be as good a tracker in the jungle as an Aztec was. That would be good to bring along, the capacity to track animals like that, or to be as sensitive to the spirits of plants. But carving virgins' hearts out from any stage above it is going to look repulsive, and rightfully so. So allergies are based on the failure to include what's beneficial from a previous stage and repressing unintegrated parts of the self from previous stages. So when we repress, we then project these and we overact their presence in others. If we're repressing something in ourselves and won't let ourselves integrate it, then when somebody else does it, we'll project on them, either inflating their goodness or turning them into a monster. Addictions are a failure to transcend and the absolutizing of any stage substitute gratifications, not letting go of previous stages. So and all substitute gratifications are thumb sucking. So the infant sucks its thumb when the nipple isn't there. The adult, an adult stuck at second chakra just looks through union through sex, a third through power and domination, a fourth through just belonging and membership, a fifth through materialism, and so on. So this is the basis of allergies and addictions. And you can see that all the stages can have allergies and addictions. So people at a holistic integral stage, before it healthily consolidate, tend to get allergic to people at a green stage a postmodern stage of development because those individuals are against hierarchy. And at an integral stage of development, holistic stage, you have to reintroduce hierarchy. The heart is the emperor. The emperor is number one. The small intestine is number two. There's actually a hierarchy, and the heart is the center. And the emperor has certain capacities to be the conductor of the orchestra that each of the individual players just doesn't have. The orchestra is the instrument that the conductor plays. So people at a pluralistic stage of development see people at a mythic stage of development as uptight, and people at a modern stage of rationalistic development are the man. And then what we do is when we repress the past, we also repress the future. So people at a holistic integral stage of development, when they're repressing postmodern people, look at people who are truly, genuinely transpersonal and just think they're postmodern. And just they can't differentiate the postmodern collective trying to reach consensus with each other, with people who are truly at a transpersonal stage of development. People who are pluralistic see people at a mythic and irrational stage of development as uptight, and then look at people who are holistic and integral, who have reinstituted hierarchy, and yell, fascist, fascist, hierarchy, racist, eugenicist. Because as soon as you start saying that there's a hierarchy to the self, a hierarchy of capacities within the self, and a hierarchy of capacities within different cultures, people say you're just colonialist. Postmodern people say that's just colonialist. All cultures are different but equal. Every perspective is different but equal. But that isn't true. There's higher and there's lower culture, and everyone on this call knows it. Nobody thinks that probably no one on the call thinks that the culture that Donald Trump is trying to construct is higher than the holistic integral culture as healers that we share in Chinese medicine. It just isn't. The values are transactional. They're 2 to 4 years old. So people at a rational stage of development see people at a magical stage as superstitious, people at a mythic stage of development as ignorant and suckers, and then they look at postmodern people who are the stage beyond them and see them as flakes. Look at those idiots who have long hair, wearing flowers and dancing to the Grateful Dead. They're flakes. What do you think Ayn Rand would have thought of the Grateful Dead? Allowing everybody at their performances to tape their shows without charging. She wouldn't have been down with it. So people at a mythic stage of development repress magic. They just kill the tribes as savages. And then they look up above them and say they see people at a rational and postmodern stages of development as being godless. So the general tendency here is that any stage before it's healthfully consolidated has allergies and addictions relative to the previous stages, represses the previous stages, and then projects that repression on the next future stage. And what does Red do? Red goes and kills all the tribes and tries to unite them under a warlord, right? And projects disdain for, and then seeing the magic that people do at the magic levels they're repressing, then look at the church and see the rituals they're doing and say that's all magic, and we have to destroy. So that's Genghis Khan headed toward the Vatican. And he was only a few months away and he died. And you know, and the Mongols made it all the way from Mongolia, I think, to the Rhine River. And they were on their way toward the Vatican, and a rider rode up and said, the great Khan is dead. And they turned around and went back and ruled much of Eastern Europe, Poland for 300 years and that area of the world, which is why you see a lot of Russians and Polish people have Asian eyes. So now we have stage fixations, and here are the different stages, and here are the fixations for survival, food, for the magic self, sex, the imperial self, power, belonging, rational self, self-esteem. Pluralistic self gets addicted to self-actualization. Holistic integral self gets addicted to just building models, bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more and more and more inclusive models. The illumined and intuitive self gets addicted to bliss, and the witness self gets addicted to detachment that comes from just witnessing. This was a 3-hour lecture today. It's all right. I think the last one was only an hour and a half or so we make up for it a little bit. So in Deepening Perspective, read the chapter on integral theory, read the chapter on states and the chapter on stages, and then optional, if you want to go for it, is to read all the stages. That's like 300 pages. But all in all, this homework is something like 330 pages. And I mean, you read 100 pages a week. It's homework. You can do it if you want to do it. Anyway, if you read those stages, it'll transform it'll transform your consciousness. And that's what this class is about. And if you can't do it by the next class, just set out to do it and keep up with it. So I want you to contemplate. I want you to notice through the day how states come and go and your relationship to them, how you tend to interpret states and make up stories about them. And I want you to notice how your patients and your friends and family relate to state experiences and the degree to which their state experience dictates their belief and their behavior. Start to see it. Contemplate. It's easier to see in other people, but start to become aware of it in yourself. Becoming aware of this in oneself is one of the hallmarks of starting to really develop into a holistic, integral human being. So start to question, what are the foundational assumptions and orientations of your worldview, and where did you learn these? So this is just the constructions of the superego. Where did you learn these? What are the assumptions of your worldview? What's your orientation? And I haven't written this here, but what are your fundamental values? What are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values you have, which you hold as sacred? Where do you get them? Are they true? And to the degree they're true, what are their deficiencies? If you absolutize them into ultimate values, what are the weaknesses that correspond to them? And this should help translations start to begin to fail. As you begin to question where you are and the assumptions you base your life on. If you read the different stage chapters in Deepening Perspectives, which stages do each of your assumptions and values correlate with? And then I want you to contemplate for yourself, what is your average stage of development, your trailing edge of development, and your leading imminent potential, your leading edge of development, and just start to see these things. Okay, my friends, thank you. 3-hour class. I never know how long it's going to take, but I always try to give everything. Thank you for engaging with this, and please come with questions in the next class. And when you ask questions, intellectual questions, abstract questions, questions on theory are just fine. But the more you can implicate yourself in these questions, the more you can put yourself on the line and implicate your own experience and your own developmental process, the more your question will impact and speak to everyone in class, and the further we'll be able to go together. So thank you all. See you soon.